Florence. One of the first auto tours that we usually have, after Rome, is Florence. Now Florence is originated as a Roman city, and later, after a long period as a flourishing trading and banking city, it was the birthplace of the Renaissance movement. The language spoken in the city during the 14th century came to be accepted as the model for what would become the Italian language, mainly thanks to the literary works of the Dante Alighieri and others. The Florentine dialect, above all the dialects, was adopted as the basis for a national language. Florence was home to the Medici, one of European history's most important noble families. Lorenzo de' Medici was the leader of a political and cultural elite of Italy in the late 15th century. Two members of the family were popes in the early 16th century, Leo X and Clement VII. Catherine de' Medici married King Henry II of France and, after his death in 1559, reigned as regent in France. Marie de' Medici married Henry IV of France and gave birth to the future King Louis XIII. The Medici reigned as Grand Dukes of Tuscany, starting with Cosimo I de' Medici in 1569 and ending with the death of John Gastone de' Medici in 1737. Florence is known as the cradle of the Renaissance, La Culla del Rinascimento, for its monuments, churches, and buildings. The best-known site of Florence is the domed cathedral of the city, Santa Maria del Fiore, known as the Duomo, whose dome was built by Filippo Brunelleschi. The nearby Campanile, partly designed by Giotto, and the baptistry buildings are also highlights. The dome, 600 years after its completion, is still the largest dome built in brick and mortar in the world. The center of the city is contained in medieval walls that were built in the 14th century to defend the city. At the heart of the city, in Piazza della Signoria, is Bartolomeo Ammanati's Fountain of Neptune, 1563 to 1565, which is a masterpiece of marble sculpture at the terminus of a still-functioning Roman aqueduct. The Palazzo Vecchio as well as the Duomo, or the city's cathedral, are the two buildings which dominate Florence's skyline. The river Arno, which cuts through the old part of the city, is as much a character in Florentine history as many of the people who lived there. Historically, the locals have had a love-hate relationship with the Arno, which alternated between nourishing the city with commerce, and destroying it by flood. Palazzo Vecchio. In 1299 the Florentines decided to build a palace to house the government organizations of the Republic. In addition, it should have been a building representative of the power of the Republic and the people. Arnolfo di Cambio, the architect of the Duomo of Florence and the Church of Santa Croce, began this construction on the ruins of the Palazzo dei Fondi and the Palazzo del Secutor di Giustizia in Piazza della Signoria. As it happened with the great constructions of that time, several generations were needed to complete the work, suffering modifications and extensions. Cosimo I de' Medici ordered a restructuring and decoration of the building during the 16th century to turn into his residence. Thus, it acquires its present appearance and becomes the Ducal Palace. Later, Cosimo I de' Medici moved his residence to the Pitti Palace and Palazzo Ducale was named Palazzo Vecchio, becoming the government offices and the place where valuables were kept. Cosimo I ordered the construction of a corridor that connected the Pitti Palace with the administration offices, currently the Uffizi Gallery, and the Palazzo Vecchio to be able to move from one place to another with more comfort and privacy. This corridor was called the Vasari Corridor, Ponte Vecchio. Built very close to the Roman crossing, the Ponte Vecchio, or Old Bridge, was the only bridge across the Arno in Florence until 1218. The current bridge was rebuilt after a flood in 1345. During World War II it was the only bridge across the Arno that the fleeing Germans did not destroy. Instead they blocked access by demolishing the medieval buildings on each side. On November 4, 1966, the bridge miraculously withstood the tremendous weight of water and silt when the Arno once again burst its banks. Giorgio Vasari, an artist and chronolist from the 1500s, attributed the bridge to Taddeo Gaddi. The construction seems to point more towards the involvement of the Dominican friars with their keen sense of proportion, harmony and use of numbers. We do know, however, that the bridge was built as a system of defense, and the windows and artistic elements that we can admire now were added after the shops were sold to the merchants. When the Medici moved from Palazzo Vecchio to Palazzo Pitti, they decided they needed a connecting route from the Uffizi to the Palazzo Pitti on the other side of the Arno that would enable them to keep out of contact with the people they ruled. The result was the Corridoio Vasariano, built in 1565 by Giorgio Vasari and which runs above the little goldsmiths' shops on the Ponte Vecchio. There have been shops on Ponte Vecchio since the 13th century. Initially, there were all types of shops, including butchers and fishmongers and, later, tanners, whose industrial waste caused a pretty rank stench in the area. In 1593, Ferdinand I decreed that only goldsmiths and jewelers be allowed to have their shops on the bridge in order to improve the well-being of all, including their own as they walked over the bridge themselves. Ponte Vecchio. Benvenuto Cellini, a 16th-century goldsmith, is honored with a bust on the bridge. By night, the wooden shutters of the shops create a look like suitcases and wooden chests, making it a very suggestive route to take for an evening passeggiata, or stroll. Ponte Vecchio is a very romantic spot in Florence, with its great views over the river and of the bridge itself. It is also possible to admire the bridge from underneath in theater presentations, the occasional concert and boat rides. The David by Michelangelo. When all was finished, it cannot be denied that this work has carried off the palm from all other statues, modern or ancient, Greek or Latin. No other artwork is equal to it in any respect, with such just proportion, beauty and excellence did Michelangelo finish it. Better than anyone else, Giorgio Vasari introduces in a few words the marvel of one of the greatest masterpieces ever created by mankind. At the Accademia Gallery, you can admire from a short distance the perfection of the most famous statue in Florence and, perhaps, in all the world, Michelangelo's David. This astonishing Renaissance sculpture was created between 1501 and 1504. It is a 14.0 feet marble statue depicting the biblical hero David, represented as a standing male nude. Michelangelo was asked by the consuls of the board to complete an unfinished project begun in 1464, and a block of marble of exceptional dimensions remained neglected for 25 years, lying within the courtyard of the Opera del Duomo. View of David's face. Michelangelo was only 26 years old in 1501, but he was already the most famous and best paid artist in his days. He accepted the challenge with enthusiasm to sculpt a large-scale David and worked constantly for over 2 years to create one of his most breathtaking masterpieces of gleaming white marble. The account of the battle between David and Goliath is told in Book 1 Samuel. Saul and the Israelites are facing the Philistines near the valley of Elah. Twice a day for 40 days, Goliath, the champion of the Philistines, comes out between the lines and challenges the Israelites to send out a champion of their own to decide the outcome in single combat. Only David, a young shepherd, accepts the challenge. Saul reluctantly agrees and offers his armor, which David declines since it is too large, taking only his sling and 5 stones from a brook. David and Goliath thus confront each other, Goliath with his armor and shield, David armed only with his rock, his sling, his faith in God and his courage. David hurls a stone from his sling with all his might and hits Goliath in the center of his forehead. Goliath falls on his face to the ground, and David then cuts off his head. Michelangelo, for the first time ever, chooses to depict David before the battle. David is tense. Michelangelo catches him at the apex of his concentration. He stands relaxed, but alert, resting on a classical pose known as contrapposto. The figure stands with one leg holding its full weight and the other leg forward, causing the figure's hips and shoulders to rest at opposing angles, giving a slight S-curve to the entire torso. The slingshot he carries over his shoulder is almost invisible, emphasizing that David's victory was one of cleverness, not sheer force. He transmits exceptional self-confidence and concentration, both values of the thinking man, considered perfection during the Renaissance. After more than 2 years of tough work, Michelangelo decided to present his giant to the members of the vestry board and to Pier Soderini, the then Gonfalonier of the Republic. In January 1504, his 14-foot-tall David was unveiled only to them. They all agreed that it was far too perfect to be placed up high in the cathedral, thus it was decided to discuss another location in town. The city council convened a committee of about 30 members, including artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Sandro Botticelli and Giuliano da Sangallo, to decide on an appropriate site for David. During the long debate, 9 different locations for the statue were discussed, and eventually the statue was placed in the political heart of Florence, in Piazza della Signoria. Thanks to its imposing perfection, the biblical figure of David became the symbol of the liberty and freedom of the Republican ideals, showing Florence's readiness to defend itself. It remained in front of Palazzo della Signoria until 1873, when it was moved into the Galleria dell'Accademia to protect it from damage and further weathering. Note the watchful eyes with carved eye bulks, pulsing veins on the back of the hands, engorged with tension. Admire the curve of the taut torso, the flexing of the thigh muscles in the right leg. For in it may be seen most beautiful contours of legs, with attachments of limbs and slender outlines of flanks that are divine, nor has there ever been seen a pose so easy, or any grace to equal that in this work, or feet, hands and head so well in accord, one member with another, in harmony, design, and excellence of artistry. Once again, Giorgio Vasari was able to synthesize the absolute perfection of this Renaissance masterpiece which still attracts, and does not disappoint, millions of visitors every year at the Galleria dell'Accademia in Florence, Duomo Florence Cathedral. The Florence Duomo, also known as Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral, is located in Duomo Square. Its construction began at the end of the 13th century under the design of Arnolfo di Cambio, a famous architect and sculptor who loved the Gothic style. The cathedral has a main nave and 2 side aisles plus a rear apse. When di Cambio passed away, the construction of the cathedral was postponed and was resumed in 1334 by Giotto, who designed the bell tower. However, the construction was interrupted again in 1337 with his death. The construction of this magnificent project continued with Andrea Pisano and Francesco Talenti finalizing its construction in 1359. The Giotto's campanile is 85 meters high and it is possible to climb to the top through its 414 steps, from where it is possible to appreciate a wonderful view of Florence. In the mid of the 14th century, Florentine artists put aside the Gothic style and incorporated the Roman style. The Gothic air of the cathedral was hidden behind the red marble of Siena, the white of Carrara and the green of Prato. The metalsmith Lorenzo Ghiberti and the sculptor Filippo Brunelleschi had the privilege of finishing the Cathedral of Florence. Brunelleschi sculpted the statues for the dome and designed an innovative project to make the Florentine cathedral the largest of its time. Brunelleschi started with the construction of the project by 1421. The polygonal base had already been completed while the dome was completed 15 years later. The red dome of the cathedral was then the largest in the world, 45 meters in diameter and 100 meters high, and soon became the symbol of Florence. The facade of the cathedral was destroyed at the end of the 16th century and Emilio de Fabris redesigned it, made some modifications and incorporated marble in different colors. This Florentine cathedral is one of the largest churches in Christianity, with its 160 meters in length, 43 meters wide and 90 meters in the transverse nave. The interior height of the dome is 100 meters. It is also a symbol of the wealth and power of the Tuscan capital during the 13th and 14th centuries. Its name derives from the lily, the symbol of Florence, and the ancient name of the town called Fiorenza.